Hello, this is Sharon Lamison, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 17th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article is about the Iran war. Energy crisis deepens as airstrikes continue. Allies cool to Trump's demand for help in keeping vital oil shipping route open. By John Grumble, Russ Bynum, and Bassem Moore. This is out of Dubai. The United Arab Emirates briefly closed and then reopened its airspace Tuesday, temporarily halting flights in a critical travel hub as the country's military said it was facing incoming attacks from Iran. The disruption came as war in the Middle East continued to rage. The Israeli military early Tuesday reported a salvo of Iranian missiles as sirens sounded south of the Sea of Galilee. No injuries were reported. The U.S. and Israel had pummeled military targets in Iran's capital a day earlier, with Israel stepping up bombardments of Iran-backed militants in Lebanon. Fears of a global energy crisis loomed even as a small number of ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz, a vital waterway through which a fifth of the world's oil normally travels. Iranian strikes on commercial ships in and around the strait have slowed shipping to a trickle, dramatically increasing oil prices and pressuring Washington to do something to ease the pain for consumers and the global economy. Brent crude, the international standard, remained over $100 a barrel. U.S. President Donald Trump said he had demanded that roughly a half dozen countries send warships to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, but his appeals brought no immediate commitments. Speaking of the Strait, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said, "From our perspective, it is open, just not for the United States, Israel, and its allies." Araghchi also rejected as delusional claims that Iran was looking for a negotiated end to the war. Since the United States and Israel attacked Iran more than 2 weeks ago, Tehran has regularly fired drones and missiles at Israel, American bases in the region, and Gulf Arab countries' energy infrastructure. The UAE shut down its airspace early Tuesday as its military reported it was responding to missile and drone threats from Iran. The closure was soon lifted. The state-run WAM news agency quoted the country General Civil Aviation Authority as saying, authorities said the situation stabilized, allowing flights to resume. The snap announcement showed the balancing act Emirati authorities face in trying to keep their long-haul carriers, Emirates and Etihad, flying as Iranian attacks continued to target the country. On Monday, an Iranian drone attack set a fuel tank ablaze at Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest for international travel. In Israel, an intercepted Iranian missile attack sprayed shrapnel Monday through Jerusalem's Old City, hitting the rooftop of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchal, just meters from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on what is revered by many Christians as the site of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. Shrapnel also fell near the Western Wall, the holiest site where Jews can pray, and within the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, the third holiest site in Islam. Missile strikes on Jerusalem have been rare in the past. Massive explosions were heard in Beirut Monday as Israel launched new attacks on the Lebanese capital, saying it was striking infrastructure related to the Iran-linked Hezbollah militia. Hezbollah began firing rockets into northern Israel after U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran began February 28. The Israeli army has issued evacuation orders for many neighborhoods in Beirut as well as southern Lebanon. Israel strikes have displaced more than 1 million Lebanese, or roughly 20% of the population, according to the Lebanese government, which says some 850 people have been killed. Some Israeli troops have pushed into southern Lebanon, and there are fears Israel is preparing a large-scale invasion. In southern Lebanon, 7 people were killed in Israeli airstrikes, according to authorities and news reports Monday. Explosions also sounded in Tehran and outlying areas soon after Israel's military announced it had launched new strikes on Iran's capital. A Tehran resident said while driving he witnessed an airstrike turn a police station to dust and heavily damage shops and cars. The man, who spoke on condition of anonymity for fear of retaliation from the government, said it felt like the end of the world. More details were not immediately available, with information coming out of Iran severely limited by internet outages, round-the-clock airstrikes, and tight restrictions on journalists. More than 1,300 people have been killed in Iran, according to the Iranian Red Crescent. Israel has carried out some 7,600 strikes on Iran, knocking out 85% of its air defenses and 70% of Iran's missile launchers, Israeli military spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Nadav Shoshani said. In Israel, 12 people have been killed by Iranian missile fire. At least 13 U.S. military members have been killed. The virtual shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz is unnerving the world economy, driving up energy prices, threatening food shortages in poor countries, destabilizing fragile states, and complicating efforts by central banks to drive down prices for consumers. On Monday, Trump said numerous countries have told him they're on the way to help police the Strait of Hormuz. But he also suggested some countries' reluctance showed a lack of reciprocity in defense agreements with the United States. Europeans have been critical of the U.S. and Israel for failing to provide clarity on their objectives in the war. The level of enthusiasm matters to me, Trump said. He didn't specify the countries, but has previously appealed to China, France, Japan, South Korea, and Britain. Brent crude fell to $100.21 per barrel on Monday, but remained up roughly 40% since the war began. Officials have been scrambling to ease prices. Fatih Birol, head of the International Energy Agency, said its 32 member countries still have additional resources of 1.4 billion barrels on top of the record 400 million they agreed to release last week to address supply constraints. Admiral Brad Cooper, the top U.S. military commander in the Middle East, said in a video posted on X that American forces are zeroing in on Iran's threats to freighters carrying oil and natural gas. Ahead of a meeting in Brussels, the European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said the bloc would discuss possibly extending a naval mission that protects ships in the Red Sea to the Strait of Hormuz without giving any details. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani told reporters in Brussels that his country favors strengthening anti-piracy and defensive missions in the Red Sea, but not expanding their role in the Strait of Hormuz. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain, which is not an EU member, told reporters that Britain and allies were working on a plan to reopen the strait. Starmer said Britain might deploy mine-hunting UK drones already in the region, but insisted it will not be drawn into the wider war. Japan and Australia said Monday that they had not been asked to help protect the strait and had no current plans to do so. This article was from the Associated Press and is accompanied by an image of an injured man talking on a cell phone Monday following a strike on a residential building in central Tehran. Explosions sounded in Iran's capital and outlying areas soon after Israel's military announced it had launched new strikes in the city. Our next article is entitled Ford Defends Move to Shield Records. Restricting public access is necessary to counter foreign threats, the Premier says. The article is by Robert Benzie and Moira Welsh from the Queen's Park Bureau. Premier Doug Ford says he's tightening Ontario's access to information laws to protect himself and his cabinet ministers from communist China and other hostile powers. In his first public comments since the progressive Conservative government announced it was excluding the records of the Premier, ministers, and parliamentary assistants and their aides from those released under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, Ford defended the move. It's about protecting cabinet confidentiality with the Ontario Public Service, he told reporters on Monday in Brockville, insisting he has nothing to hide. But experts and critics said that's not how it appears and suggested that Ford's claims about China are unfounded. Information and Privacy Commissioner Patricia Kosiam warned Ford's shocking announcement was about hiding government-related business to evade public accountability. Freedom of information laws exist to provide Ontarians with vital information about how government decisions are made, on what basis, who influenced, and whether the public interest is being served, said Kosiam, adding the changes would greatly diminish her office's oversight powers. If records about government business can be shielded from scrutiny simply because they sit in a minister's office, on a staffer's device, or within a political account, public accountability is eviscerated. Ford countered that he was just bringing Ontario's Freedom of Information law in line with the federal standard, as well as other provinces, at a time when enemies are exploiting loopholes to gain access to sensitive data. We're following the other provinces, folks. This isn't anything new. It's not pulling a rabbit out of your hat, he said. We've got to protect ourselves against the communist Chinese that are infiltrating our country, Canada, the U.S., everything into our education system, into high-tech companies. That's who we have to protect from, too. So it's serious. NDP leader Marit Stiles said, "Those are ridiculous excuses. The Premier isn't worried about China. He's worried about what the people of Ontario will see when his phone records are released," Stiles said. The Premier is making every excuse under the sun to justify changing the rules so he and his cabinet can hide from public accountability. Stephanie Carvin, an assistant professor at Carleton University and a former national security analyst, said that while Chinese spy services do use open sources for intelligence gathering, a 2-year ATIP access to information and privacy request is not their methodology. So I strongly disagree with the Premier's assertion, Carvin said in an interview from Taipei, Taiwan. Ron Deibert, a counterintelligence expert and director of the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab, said, given China's extensive cyber espionage capabilities, there's a much more likely way for the Chinese Communist Party to get access to his cell phone than filing an access to information request, and it would be speedier too. Ford's plan to shield himself and colleagues from freedom of information access comes after his government has been accused of improperly politicizing some decisions related to the controversial $2.5 billion Skills Development Fund and the canceled $8.28 billion Greenbelt land swap. The Greenbelt fiasco is currently under investigation by the RCMP, while the Skills Development Fund affair continues to dog the Tories. Last October, Auditor General Shelley Spence questioned Skills Development Fund financial approvals made by Labor Minister David Pickney and his predecessor Monty McNaughton. The pending change in the Access to Information Law, which will take effect later this spring, means that all communications among ministers and their aides would be kept secret. News organizations like The Star often use documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests to shed light on issues that governments try to keep private. Ford bristled when asked if the retroactive changes were being made because of an ongoing legal challenge by Global News to gain access to the records of his personal cell phone, which he uses to conduct public business. People call me, 1,000 people a day, on very personal issues. I'm not going to release personal confidential information about people's lives, said the Premier, who publicly shares his personal cell number. Every personal problem people have, they call me. I feel like a psychologist every day trying to solve everyone's personal issues. However, Ford also uses his phone for official government work. Business Minister Stephen Crawford admitted Ontarians would have access to less internal information after the law is passed, but he downplayed that. I should have everybody know that over 95% of what you're able to access now, you will still be able to access, said the minister, who did not elaborate on how he arrived at that percentage. Crawford emphasized there will continue to be oversight by the Privacy Commissioner, by the Auditor General, etc., so nothing's really changing on that front. He added, the current law is very outdated because it was passed in 1988, long before the digital age of smartphones and cloud computing, and he raised concerns about interference from abroad. We're aligning with the majority of jurisdictions in the rest of Canada, and we're also ensuring that foreign countries, foreign companies, which have been taking advantage of our openness through predatory information gathering, will no longer be able to, said Crawford. Critics from both the right and left have blasted the Tories for the move. What is Ford and his cabinet trying to hide? Thundered Noah Jarvis, Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Liberal MPP Stephanie Smythe, Toronto St. Paul's, a former journalist, wondered, what is he protecting himself from? Green leader Mike Schreiner said Ford was dodging accountability before the legislature resumes sitting next Monday. This article is accompanied by a photo of Doug Ford with the caption, critics say Premier Doug Ford's plan to tighten Ontario's access to information laws is about hiding government-related business to evade public accountability and is a Canadian Press file photo. You are listening to readings of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next article is under the mental health headline of more youth turning to self-harm, study finds. Steepest increase found among girls and women worldwide. by Francine Copen, senior writer. A sideline says self-harm has become a leading cause of emergency department visits among people ages 24 and younger, according to the report. Medically reported self-injury among young people in wealthy countries, including Canada, has been rising steadily in recent decades, more strongly among girls and women than boys and men, according to the results of an international review published Monday in JAMA Pediatrics. Cases of self-injury among people ages 24 and younger who were treated in medical settings rose about 3.5% a year between 2000 and 2024, meaning the number of reports more than doubled over the period, according to the research led by Dr. Natasha Saunders of Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children. For self-reported self-injuries, young people reporting in surveys that they engaged in self-injury without seeking medical attention, the annual rate of increase was 2.5%. The most surprising finding was that the increase has been going on for a long time and it's been sustained, said Dr. Ewell Cohen, a sick kids pediatrician who was also one of the researchers. The trend predated the pandemic and seems to have continued since. It doesn't seem like there's one thing that's causing it, said Cohen, who is also the program head of Child Health Evaluative Sciences at Sick Kids. The increase was 3 times higher among women and girls ages 24 and younger than among boys the same age, 3.6% versus 1.2%. The rates were similar across the countries studied, including Canada, said Dr. Cohen. We compared by world region and we found no meaningful differences in world regions. Self-harm has become a leading cause of emergency department visits among people ages 24 and younger, according to the report. Our findings underscore the need for enhanced support systems for children and youth in crisis, particularly among female individuals, the report concludes. It notes that other solutions may include timely and effective interventions and follow-up care for children seen in hospital and other medical settings. The research also recommends school and community-based strategies to foster mental health well-being. The meta-analysis looked at 42 studies conducted between 2000 and 2024 of 234,054,520 people from 12 high-income countries with comparable health care systems and data tracking, allowing researchers to analyze long-term trends across similar populations. The mean self-injury rate of those seeking medical attention in the first year among girls was 14.1 cases per 10,000. For boys, the mean rate in the first year was 9.1 cases per 10,000 population, according to the study. Among those not seeking medical attention, the mean reported rate of self-injury was much higher, 275 cases per 10,000 population, according to the research. Rates of self-report will always be higher than rates of people who seek medical attention, said Cohen. While incidents of self-harm have increased in tandem with other mental health diagnoses, including depression and anxiety, the reasons for the increase in self-harm require more study, researchers found. The analysis pointed to social media and online platforms as possible contributing factors, especially when content that normalizes and validates self-harm is circulated to vulnerable individuals. The social media platforms can also directly affect mental health, negatively impacting self-esteem and body image by promoting and reinforcing unrealistic appearance standards. The platforms can also expose users to cyberbullying, harassment, and foster compulsive or addictive usage patterns, according to researchers. The COVID-19 pandemic likely amplified these risks by increasing online engagement, reducing access to protective in-person supports, and contributing to heightened mental distress. Shelley Kullberger, a spokesperson for Miles Ahead, a grassroots organization working to advance child and youth mental health, said their interviews with young women who sought emergency help in hospital for self-harm have revealed that they are exposed to online content about self-harm through social media. The social contagion effect around self-harm for girls is very high, said Kullberger, the former principal suicide prevention officer for the state of Queensland, Australia. According to Kullberger, mental health services for children and youth are chronically underfunded in Canada, and patients are often met with long wait times for care. ERs are often the first point of contact for families who have been trying to access mental health services. In response, Kullberger says Miles Ahead has developed a framework for ERs to help provide timely clinical and peer support for patients experiencing a mental health crisis related to self-harm and suicide. Self-injury is defined as the deliberate act of causing physical harm to oneself, either with or without suicidal intent. It's a known indicator of future mental health challenges, including anxiety, depression, substance abuse disorders, and an increased risk of death by suicide. It is associated with reduced life expectancy of 11 to 18 years, according to the research. Approximately 10% of young people have engaged in self-injury at some point, with varying levels of suicide ideation, according to the study. Cohen said that considerable investment has been made in acute care for mental health within hospitals, but more is needed. I think the message from this research is that while it's important, that's insufficient, and we need to also focus on prevention and early supports, he said. The study was funded by a grant from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. People struggling with self-injury can dial 988 to reach a crisis hotline. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next article comes out of Quebec. Driver in daycare attack labeled high risk accused. Ruling prevents man from leaving psychiatric hospital, puts restrictions on treatment changes. We have a sidebar saying that last April, a judge ruled that Pierre Nye Saint-Amand was not criminally responsible for crashing into a daycare in 2023, killing 2 kids and injuring 6 others, saying he was likely in psychosis at the time. The article is by Siddhartha Banerjee, out of Montreal. The Quebec man found not criminally responsible for killing 2 children after driving a city bus into a Montreal area daycare has been labeled by a judge a high-risk accused a designation that imposes additional restrictions on his detention and treatment in hospital. On Monday, Superior Court Justice Eric Downs also upheld the constitutionality of a section of the criminal code that permits offenders found not criminally responsible because of a mental order to be designated high risk, rejecting arguments from the defense that the status reinforces stereotypes against the mentally ill. Last April, Downs ruled that Pierre Nye Saint-Amand, 54, was not criminally responsible for the 2023 attack because the former city bus driver had likely been in psychosis when he crashed the vehicle into a daycare in Laval, Quebec, Montreal's northern suburb. The crash killed 4-year-old Jacob Gauthier and a 5-year-old girl named Maiva, whose family name is covered by a publication ban at the request of her parents. 6 other children were injured. The court grants the prosecutor's request. It designates the accused as high risk under the criminal code, Downs said at the Laval courthouse. There is a marked probability that the accused will use violence in a manner that endangers the life or safety of another person. The acts that gave rise to the offenses are of such a brutal nature that there is a risk of serious physical or psychological harm to another person. The high-risk status prevents Saint-Amand from leaving the psychiatric hospital where he is being detained, except for medical reasons or for purposes of his treatment. It also limits the decisions that the province's Mental Health Review Board can make in his case. Any changes to his treatment plan or to the restrictions of his movements would need to be put before the Quebec Superior Court. Saint-Amand has maintained he doesn't remember what happened on the day of the crash. He will remain detained at the Philippe Pinel Psychiatric Hospital in Montreal. The actions committed by the accused on February 8, 2023, defy comprehension, Downs said. Young children perished, others were seriously injured. The Quebec community was shaken to its very core. Also Monday, Downs granted victim status to 24 people, ensuring they'll be able to take part in future mental health hearings involving the accused and make impact statements. One of those granted status is Melanie Goulet, whose daughter was pinned under the bus after the crash. She told reporters she felt a certain relief with Monday's ruling. Everything concerning the court is now over. It's not over for us, unfortunately, but it's true that this chapter is closed. The Crown had sought a high-risk status for Saint-Amand, with prosecutors arguing that by requiring both the province's Mental Health Review Board and the Superior Court to monitor the accused, there would be a 2-step validation process to ensure the right decisions are taken in his case. I think everyone is breathing a sigh of relief this morning, Crown Prosecutor Simon Blaise told reporters after the hearing. This status is a double-checking process implemented for very rare cases where accused persons represent a high potential for dangerousness. Saint-Amand's lawyers, meanwhile, had argued the status was unconstitutional and reinforced stereotypes against the mentally ill. The high-risk label is temporary and revocable since the legal conditions are met, Downs said, adding that while he found no violation of constitutional rights in the case, the court remains aware that this is a restrictive regime for the rights of certain defendants found not criminally responsible. This article was from the Canadian Press. Our next article is entitled Toronto Police to Release OPP Report. Probe looks at whether 3 officers colluded and provided false testimony during Zamir trial. And a sidebar says, Umar Zamir is seen kneeling in a still from police body camera footage shortly after his arrest by undercover Toronto police officers in July 2021. Zamir testified he believed he was fleeing from hoodlums, not police officers, when his car hit 55-year-old Constable Jeffrey Northrup. And there is a picture showing that. The article is by Betsy Powell, Courts reporter. The Toronto Police Service is set to release the findings of an Ontario provincial police investigation into the conduct of 3 officers involved in the prosecution of Umar Zamir, who was acquitted of all charges in the tragic death of Constable Jeffrey Northrup nearly 2 years ago. Toronto Police Chief Myron Demkiw will take questions about the long-awaited report at a 1:30 p.m. news conference on Tuesday. Northrup, a veteran officer, died after being struck by Zamir's vehicle in the underground parking garage beneath Nathan Phillips Square in July 2021. Zamir testified he believed he was fleeing from hoodlums, not police officers, when his car hit the 55-year-old Northrup. Zamir, his wife, and young son had been visiting the Canada Day festivities in downtown Toronto and had just returned to their BMW when they were approached by the officers, who were dressed in plain clothes while investigating an unrelated stabbing. Soon after Northrup's death, first-degree murder charges were laid against Zamir based on sworn statements from 3 Toronto police officers, Lisa Forbes, Tony Correa, and Charnel Paez. They testified that Northrup and Forbes identified themselves as police and that Northrup was standing in front of the BMW when Zamir accelerated. Zamir was jailed and remained in custody until he was granted bail months later in a decision that sparked outrage from politicians, including then Mayor John Tory and Premier Doug Ford. However, during the trial in the spring of 2024, 2 collision reconstruction experts, including one from Toronto Police, told the jury that Northrup was already on the ground when the vehicle struck him, a finding that supported the defense claim Zamir was not aware he had driven over Northrup. Northrup was a 31-year veteran of the Toronto Police Service. He was remembered as a gentle giant and a caring mentor to his younger colleagues. His death was marked by thousands in a funeral service at BMO Field. In a written ruling, Superior Court Justice Anne Malloy, who presided over the trial, questioned whether the officers had deliberately made up their account, suggesting they may have been trying to cast themselves and Northrup in a better light, indifferent to the implications for Mr. Zamir. She noted Forbes' memory may have been affected by trauma. She was present during her partner's death. The judge concluded that Paez and Correa not only lied, but colluded to lie. The absence of an apparent motive for Zamir to intentionally run down Northrup was the elephant in the room, Malloy told the jury. What motive would this person have to deliberately run down a police officer in front of 3 other police officers when he has done nothing wrong? After Zamir was acquitted, The judge apologized to him for what he had endured. The next day, with legal observers questioning whether the case should ever have gone to trial, DEMQ requested that the OPP conduct an external review of the service's practices and the officer's conduct in connection with the case. The Toronto force received the 55-page report last week. Nader Hassan, the lawyer who won Zamir's acquittal, released a statement on the weekend saying he has serious misgivings about the secretive review process. Hassan wrote that the OPP never contacted Zamir or his legal team about its investigation. We have never been informed of this investigation's mandate, its terms of reference, its process, nor its findings. We certainly have never been asked if we had anything to contribute to this process. Rather than a police agency, the egregious police misconduct required a truly independent public review, his statement said. Hassan alleged the misconduct included 3 officers colluding and committing perjury to convict an innocent man. Hassan's statement included a comment from Zamir, who said he and his wife Ada want to move on from the case and live, work, and raise our children in peace. That said, I had hoped that the Toronto Police Service would have learned from the mistakes it made in my case. In response to Hassan's statement, TPS spokesperson Stephanie Sawyer said in an email that, given the gravity of the assertions made during the trial, the chief requested the OPP to conduct an independent review of the 3 officers involved. OPP Commissioner Thomas Carrick accepted the request and assigned the OPP Criminal Investigation Bureau to investigate, her email said. This was a criminal investigation. The OPP has extensive experience conducting complex investigations across Ontario and was well positioned to carry out a thorough and impartial review. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next article is entitled Experts Throw Cold Water on Lake Idea. Infilling waterfront to build convention center could take years and faces costly challenges. It is written by Raju Mudhar, staff reporter. We could call it Cape Convention, an extension using infill to add to Toronto's shoreline to create more land, in this case for Premier Doug Ford's new Shock and Awe Convention Center, is possible, experts say. But it would take a huge amount of our 2 most precious resources, time and money. Announced last week, Ford said that Toronto is missing out on conventions due to the size of the aging Metro Toronto Convention Center, MTCC, as stated in a 2023 Auditor General's report, though trends show such large gatherings are on the wane. While city-owned Exhibition Place, which has 192 acres of underutilized land, is the likeliest location of the proposed 2 million square foot convention center, the Premier said there are other possibilities, such as using fill to extend the shoreline into Lake Ontario. The Star talked to experts about the feasibility of building on the lake, though details are still scant on how it would be built. The Premier envisioned a convention center that is 2 million square feet in size, almost 5 times the current MTCC, and reports say that he is considering a site west of Toronto's waterfront on Lake Ontario, somewhere between Ontario Place and Humber Bay. A throwback. There have been no feasibility studies on building a convention center on the lake, but in some ways it is a throwback to Toronto's history, as the city's original shoreline was at Front Street. Everything south of that was created using infill, although it took over 120 years, starting in the 1800s, and then ending with Ontario Place Island created in the 1970s. More recently, the $1.4 billion flood reclamation project at the south of the Don River has built a new island, which is the home of the newly opened Beedashig Park in the Portland. Is it feasible? This is a conversation I have a lot about large infrastructure projects that the Premier mentions as a surprise. We can build almost anything, right? Like, sure, we could build this. The question is not, is it technically possible? Of course it's possible, said Shoshana Sachs, an associate professor at University of Toronto's Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering. It's really more a question of time and money. She pointed out that Hong Kong built an airport on infill, but they did it 2 decades ago, and it cost $24 billion at the time. She estimates that it could take a minimum of 20 years to create a landmass that might be able to hold a convention center of that size, adding that all large infrastructure projects are usually delayed and cost more than expected. Lake filling is not a new phenomenon. It is practiced in every waterfront city and is not generally problematic, said Fadi Massaud, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism at U of T. The issue is that placing a 2 million square foot behemoth on infill in the lake is unnecessary, costly, and problematic. The cost to stabilize the shoreline, source clean fill matter, pass federal environmental review, and ensure the building and its foundations are flood-proof is nonsensical. Massaud said that these types of ideas of building more land on water are often perceived as a shortcut to avoid friction with neighbors, constituents, and planning reviews. Tamir El-Daribi, a professor of engineering at U of T, pointed out that when Toronto built the shoreline, it was nowhere near as built up as it is now. It would require a massive construction project in the middle of heavily populated areas. But to start building it, he says, you need to create a cofferdam, which is a watertight structure built within a body of water. There's a variety of ways to do it, but just imagine that you are building a very thick wall around the area, and then between this thick wall and the area and the shore, you will fill it. You will have to do this filling with specific types of soils compacted to levels that are going to be able to withstand roads and infrastructure, said El-Darabi. Would it be strong enough? Oh, that's the easiest part. You put more money into it, said El-Darabi with a laugh. You add more concrete. You put stronger soil. You compact it more. There's a ton of ways to make sure that it's as strong, as reliable as the natural soil, but one of them will add to the cost. In terms of costs, it all depends on the details, but it would likely cost several $billions. His other concerns include exactly who would build it, as it's not something engineering companies here have much experience with, and he suggested we call the Netherlands, as they have extensive experience building islands. Ford had said there's a tremendous amount of infill coming from the tunnels being built for transit projects, but Sachs also pointed out that sourcing that could also become an issue, as economics have led to slowdowns in building construction. A possible solution. Ford has also proposed building a tunnel underneath Highway 401 with a 2-year feasibility project underway. So is it possible these two projects could be linked? The Star put this to Sachs, who who did some quick math using a lot of assumptions because there aren't any details, using the Portlands as a comparison point, where there is 1.4 million cubic meters of contaminated soil in an area about a kilometer long as a base. So with the assumption that it's a 10-meter diameter tunnel that is 40 kilometers long, she estimates that it could provide 12 million cubic meters of fill. That's assuming it's all clean, which probably it's not, and also assuming it's all useful, which is probably not. So, maybe, said Sachs. It depends a lot on size. But you've now tied this project to one that's even less feasible, right? The tunnel under the 401 would take much longer, cost way more money, and is much less likely to happen on any kind of relevant timeline. So you're waiting for the 401 tunnel. We're now pushing this much further down the line. Our next article is under the education headline, Toronto Catholic Teachers Fired Over Racist Chat Messages. It's written by Kristen Rashovi, senior writer. 2 Toronto Catholic high school teachers have been fired for making racist comments in an online chat. A letter sent home to parents at the school, obtained by the Star, said, confronting racism and discrimination is a responsibility we take seriously. When conduct harms students and our school community, how we respond matters. The teachers at James Cardinal McEwan are no longer employed by the Toronto Catholic District School Board and were notified of their termination on February 12, 2026, the letter said. Last month, allegations surfaced that the duo had made a racial slur and posted an anti-black meme via a student athletics Instagram account. The board came under fire from the advocacy group Parents of Black Children, which wanted immediate action. The letter, sent out Friday by Executive Superintendent Shauna Campbell, goes on to say that when incidents like this occur, the process to address them can limit what the board is able to share publicly and the timing of updates. This should not be mistaken for inaction, and we appreciate your patience as this process unfolded. Campbell said, once it received the images in question, the teachers were immediately removed from the school and placed on leave. We recognize that anti-black racism and other forms of racism and discrimination exist and acknowledge the impact this incident has had at McEwan and across our school communities, and that social workers are on hand to support students. It is unclear what, if any, steps the local unit of the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association is taking in light of the firings. We do not comment on matters regarding individual members, said local president Antonella DiCarlo. An email from a board spokesman confirmed that the 2 teachers involved in the incident at James Cardinal McEwan Catholic Secondary School are no longer employed by the board. The matter has been reported to the Ontario College of Teachers. Parents of black children have been calling on the college to investigate. It is the oversight body for the profession, and that the teachers be removed. This comes with files from the Canadian Press. Our next article is about the Mideast War. Leaders say oil ship safe passage must be restored. Carney meets Starmer in London as Iran conflict disrupts shipping routes. The article is accompanied by a picture with Prime Minister Mark Carney and Diana Fox-Carney, with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Victoria Starmer in London on Monday. Starmer said the UK is working with its allies to come up with a viable plan to reopen the Strait of Hormuz as quickly as possible. It is written by David Baxter out of London. Prime Minister Mark Carney and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer agreed during a meeting in London on Monday that safe passage must be restored through the Strait of Hormuz. Their discussion came after U.S. President Donald Trump issued a public demand for other countries to send warships to keep the strait open. It's only appropriate that people who are the beneficiaries of the strait will help to make sure that nothing bad happens there. If there's no response, or if it's a negative response, I think it will be very bad for the future of NATO, Trump said in an interview with the Financial Times. About 1/5 of the world's oil normally ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea via the Gulf of Oman. Iran has been attacking ships passing through the strait since the U.S. and Israel launched a surprise attack on Iran at the end of February. Iran also has said it will allow passage of some ships as long as they don't belong to the U.S. or its allies. The war has driven up the global price of oil, which is expected to lead to higher inflation, adding to the affordability crisis in Canada and the U.S. Carney and Starmer met at 10 Downing Street Monday morning. A readout of the meeting from Carney's office mentioned only that the two leaders discussed the situation in the Middle East and condemned Iran's missile and drone attacks on civilians and energy infrastructure. A readout from Downing Street said the two leaders agreed on the need for stability and the protection of international shipping routes. Bill Blair, Canada's High Commissioner to the UK, said ahead of the meeting that Canada supports efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, but is not getting directly involved in the conflict. The UK is considering sending naval assets to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's very important that the two prime ministers have an opportunity to discuss each of our collective approaches, Blair told reporters Sunday. Trump has called on countries affected by the disruption in the strait, specifically the UK, China, France, Japan, and South Korea, to send ships and other military assets to help reopen it. We have to stop now, so if you would like to hear the entire article, please feel free to call the station. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 17th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Sharon. Thank you for listening.